David, I think we need to explain why we're making this series of podcasts, Creating Churchill.
Well, I think the quick answer is that November the 30th this year will be exactly a century and a half since Churchill was born in 1874. And he's not like many of those now forgotten Victorians. Churchill still excites interest and controversy today. In fact, I like to say Churchill isn't 150 years old. He's 150 years young because he's such a hardy perennial. He just makes people think and talk and argue. And frankly, I think you and I are actually bugged by him. If I look back, in my case, I grew up in the 60s at a time when he died, and I can remember the state funeral in 65, watched it on television with my parents. That made a very big impression on me. Also remember the opening of Chartwell, the family home in Kent, and we didn't live far away, so we often visited it. And then in later life, when I became a historian and I was thinking and writing about the Second World War, you just could not escape Churchill. He was always there. So in many ways, you could say he's been someone who's been with me for much of my life.
I think I want to do the series because in many ways Churchill is very familiar to me, and yet he remains an enigma. And I've been trying to think why I have a hazy sense of him. And I think it's partly how I first experienced him through his voice. My parents had an audio cassette of his wartime speeches, which were set to dramatic music. And I remember this rich, booming, nasal voice. And it was all very unreal and very theatrical. Then as I learnt more about him at school, I realised what an extraordinary, almost superhuman life he'd had. Here was somebody who was a soldier, an adventurer, a journalist, an MP, a minister, a prime minister, war leader, and a painter as well, a pretty good painter. And it just seemed too good to be true. And then I realised, working on films with you over several years, that Churchill had created a lot of this story himself. His image and his life were embellished, perhaps. I just then have questions about how trustworthy is the story that we think we know about Churchill.
Well, he certainly was determined to shape history. That was his really great ambition. And he was convinced that he had to do it twice over, through deeds and through words. So whether he was a soldier, young soldier, or a politician later on, he was doing something and then writing about it in the newspapers or writing books about it. And that was intended very deliberately to drive home his narrative about what had happened. And that made a very powerful statement about himself, which has been then picked up by biographers, writers, people who've made films about him. But what's interesting is that in the 21st century, particularly, the image that Churchill's built up has been called into question by more dissident voices.
Yeah, I'm really struck by how Churchill's become a bit of an ideological football, really, in the culture war. The left attack him for imperialism and being in charge during the Bengal famine. And increasingly in America, the so-called alt-right criticize him for, as they see it, unnecessarily prolonging the Second World War and for controversial decisions like the firebombing of Dresden.
Yeah, well, I suppose in a way what you're pointing to is another aspect of this business of creating Churchill, because he's like any other historical character. Reputations are affected by the changing context of the times. And Churchill's image has changed over time because of changing contemporary attitudes to issues such as race and empire.
So I think what we're trying to do with this podcast is to get away from that and take a different approach. We're asking, can we see Churchill more clearly through the way his contemporaries saw him?
Yes, saw him, but also how he was shaped by them, by the people he collaborated with. He clashed with friends, with rivals, enemies, all sorts of people in ways that any human being's life is shaped by our contemporaries. Your life, my life. Although he's an extraordinary character, in many ways a self-made man, we should see him as an ordinary person shaped by relationships with others. So we've got episodes that focus on most of Churchill's key relationships, including Lloyd George, the politician who was his mentor, Neville Chamberlain, the great political rival of the 30s, foes such as Mahatma Gandhi, who did more than any other Indian to bring down the Raj, Hitler, whom Churchill despised, yet, ironically, the Führer's strategic gamble in 1940 and the way that he attacked France made possible Churchill's finest hour. We've got supportive allies like Roosevelt, frenemies like Stalin, and also Churchill's long-suffering wife, Clementine, who I think played an essential part in his path to greatness. So, can we better see his strengths and his weaknesses through their eyes to get a deeper understanding of the historical Churchill? And I think this matters because in so many ways, Britain today still lives in Churchill's shadow. And we need to understand how that shadow was created and is still being created.